Everyone, and welcome to a really exciting event today. We're here to talk about two concepts that usually don't go together. On the one hand, innovation and entrepreneurship, and on the other, college accreditation. Going back to 2019, there were regulations that were enacted that took college accreditation from a state where it had been static for a while and made a number of changes. And one of those changes, which I feel was the most significant, was the removal of what was once a regional monopoly, where you had a number of different college accreditors, six regional college accreditors, that were essentially given a monopoly by the federal government to accredit most colleges and universities in a particular region. Now, there were other options. There were so-called national accreditors, but due to history and state mandates, more than 90% of the students in the country attended a college or university that was approved by a regional accreditor. And on top of it, a lot of the other accreditors in the states did things that made it seem as though national accreditation was inferior. They discriminated against credit transfer from institutions that were nationally accredited versus regionally accredited, even though the federal government made no qualitative difference between regional and national. And so what the Department of Education did was, through its regulatory process, clarified that there is no difference between regional and national. And now there, even though sometimes you'll hear people say regional accreditors, there is no such thing anymore as regional accreditors. And instead, there are simply institutional accreditors that accredit colleges and universities in the country for purposes of gaining access to Title IV funds. And while each of these accreditors still accredits most of the institutions in its region, it's possible that's changing. And we're hearing that some of those accreditors are looking beyond their traditional borders. They've already had to update their scope to recognize the fact that even though home campus in a certain state is their primary location, they may have campuses across the country and even across the world that the accreditor is responsible for overseeing. And so this is a long overdue recognition that accreditation has changed. And most excitingly, there's a possibility for the first time to have new accreditors. It's not that that was impossible before, but gaining recognition from the Department of Education was so difficult and so expensive that it seemed almost not even worth trying. And so the regulations in 2019 did a few other things. They removed some of the prohibitions that were almost explicit prohibitions on innovation, where standards, policies, procedures, and even decisions to grant or deny accreditation had to be, quote, widely accepted from the broader higher education community, including faculty, institutions, licensing bodies, and the other accreditors. And so you basically had to go make sure the thing you were doing was okay by the establishment players. And so before you even got started, you had to make sure you weren't doing anything too different. That's changing. And we're fortunate today to have three new accreditors that are starting up. I'm going to introduce them in just a moment, but just want to mention that although some of the federal requirements are gone, some of the state requirements still remain. There are still state statutes that explicitly point to a particular accreditor, either at the institutional level or for some programmatic accreditors. And there are barriers that were removed that may just come back. So although the department removed these requirements when I was there, there's been a little bit of backsliding, and we're certainly going to talk about that to perhaps question if a state is forcing its colleges and universities to switch accreditors, or reversing some of the flexibility to try new things, which is something that was an important part of the 2019 regulations. But there's good news, because some of these innovations have taken place. because you've seen Florida and North Carolina pass legislation to remove some of the state level barriers. Texas had a similar bill that passed one house already, and it's possible that bill will come back in the next legislative session. And there are also changes being proposed through proposals like Dr. Virginia Fox's College Cost Reduction Act, which would provide even more federal flexibility for innovation. It would allow for more on-ramps, more industry-specific accreditors, more state flexibility. So there's a lot of exciting things happening at both the state level and the federal level. But to me, the thing that is most interesting is that just a minor regulatory change or two that didn't get a whole lot of attention at the time has, I hope, played some role in spurring innovation and people who want to dedicate themselves to starting brand new college accreditors, and that's what we're going to hear about. So I'll take down this map of the way things once were and introduce you to the folks who have generously agreed to spend some time with us today. The first is Stieg Leslie. He's the president and founder of the Post-Secondary Commission. Stieg is also a part-time senior lecturer at Harvard Business School, where he teaches entrepreneurship. He began his career as a high-tech entrepreneur, mainly in Amazon, and has worked extensively over several decades as a social entrepreneur focused on K-16 education reform in the U.S. He's founded and led several successful education-related nonprofits. And he holds a BA in comparative literature from Princeton and a combined JD MBA degree from Harvard Law School and Harvard Business School. Rob Manzer serves as president of the American Academy for Liberal Education, is the co-founder and chief academic officer of Accreditation. He previously served as vice president for academic affairs at St. Edward's University, and career highlights include creating over 500 course sharing consortia, including the world's largest ever implementation of adapted learning technology in American higher education, founding the United Methodist College Washington Consortium, and developing the largest concurrent enrollment program in Nebraska. He holds a PhD from the University of Chicago and has published articles in top journals of political science, including the Political Science Review and American Journal of Political Science. And third, we have Tony Bita, who is the executive director of the National Association for Academic Excellence, which is another new accreditation agency. He previously served as founding partner of the Transformation Collective, and before that led the Accrediting Council for Independent Colleges and Schools. He has more than 40 years of experience as a leader of executive teams. Really exciting panel. Again, this is something that doesn't happen too often, where you have people who are starting brand new things in higher ed, and certainly not in accreditation. So what I'd love to just start with, and we'll start with you, Rob, and then go around to the other two. But tell us in just a few minutes, what are you building?
Yeah, so in the case of the American Academy for Liberal Education, I guess maybe characterize it as a running start, nearly 30 years. This was an accreditor that was formed in the 1990s, 1996, was recognized by the Department of Education, so it was possible. But it focused on providing greater support for Western Civ curricula at the time. Didn't succeed, but did architect some rather impressive standards around liberal education, and has continued to accredit at the program level for universities, but also for charter schools. So what I'd like to just say, I guess, about AALE is that this is a living, breathing 30-year experiment in alternative accreditation, from which I think a new AALE could benefit, but also other accreditors, and we're eager to share our learnings.
That's great, Rob. Tony, do you want to go next? What are you building, and why is it exciting?
Thanks, Michael. We began the journey for establishing the National Association for Academic Excellence about 2 months ago. And the impetus for this comes from a recognition and a demand in the marketplace for an alternative to the embedded traditional accreditation agencies and entities, which have not only a strong presence within academia, but also uh, provide the force of suppressing, in many cases, innovation and attempting to be all things to all institutions. We're going to be much more narrowly focused on that and looking to assure the quality of institutions that are focused on academic excellence, robust scholarship, and independence of thought. I don't think that's going to be a market that will encompass all 50 states and all their institutions, but it will probably encompass many institutions in many states that are looking for an alternative to the traditional regional style accreditation. What really gets me excited about this is that we're building it from the ground up, and we're building it with full awareness and attention to all of the technology, the IT platforms, and the other forms of innovation that can be applied when you don't have to start with a very structured and rigid set of accreditation standards, and instead can build from scratch those that are relevant, those that have the potential for impact, and also hopefully will pass the test with the Department of Ed when it comes time for recognition.
Steve?
Thank you, Michael. And thanks for having us all here and for creating this forum for accreditation. It's nice to see. The Post-Secondary Commission is a couple of years old now. We're a few years into what will be a multi-year process to seek recognition from the Department of Ed as an institutional accreditor. And the salient quality, I would say, of what we're doing is that we're very focused on student outcomes as an accreditor. And we're particularly focused as an accreditor on economic outcomes, since they're so important to such a large majority of students, and since economic mobility, safety, and opportunity is such a common preference in the public policy basis for higher ed. And just to say another word about that, Michael, we will spend a lot of time as an accreditor measuring fairly and measuring accurately the wage outcomes that students experience because they enroll in higher ed. We'll do that with extraordinary amounts of data and empirical attention to detail. And we will then also go on to set standards and bright line accountability around wage outcomes that accrue to students if we measure them fairly and accurately in these institutions. And doing that, I think, will be an interesting or an appealing accreditor to a subset of institutions in our country that do remarkable things, especially with students from low-income backgrounds and producing economic opportunity for them. Will be an appealing accreditor institutions that want to be recognized and held accountable for those things. And another purpose in all of this for us is to try to model an accreditation practice and an accountability practice that relies on very fair, very accurate measurement of economic returns in higher ed, and to work on that puzzle and to try to make it available to the field.
So how do you do that, though, Stieg? We've certainly got a lot of studies that have been out there. You've got the Department of Education's college scorecard that publishes some of this information now. Gainful employment is looking at this. So there is kind of this growing bipartisan consensus around looking at this type of information. But when it comes to strict accountability, that does break down a little bit. And a lot of institutions will say, well, how can you hold me accountable for that? How do I control the wages that my graduates make?
Yeah.
Talk about that.
I will. And let me just emphasize the first point, Michael, which is there's widespread agreement among a very large majority of students in all subsets of higher education that a primary, if not the primary goal of theirs in attending higher ed is to have their economic interests protected and to go on to a better economic life. And that's reflected in the politics of higher ed. And there has been, I think you're right, a lot of movement, a lot of bipartisan movement towards a stronger, clearer, consensus-driven conversation around a basic ask of higher ed that it generate at least economic safety and mobility for students, in addition to all the other incredibly worthwhile outcomes that higher ed ought to produce. And you see that reflected in the college scorecard in a lot of states where data is beginning to aggregate around this question and the policy conversation heading towards it. Now, to answer your question, Michael, we as an accreditor, if we're serious about holding institutions accountable for them, we simply then have to sign up to measure it in a way that is completely honest intellectually and requires an extraordinary amount of data. So much so that in our case as an accreditor, we'll only operate in states. Texas is one state like that for us now, where we have access via restricted data use agreements to very nuanced sets of wage records and educational records for students, so that when we approach an institution, we can notice the students enrolling in that institution for who they are. We can track their wages. And very importantly, Michael, and I won't go on at great length about this because whoever signed up for this on the internet will immediately log out because I'll just ruin any interest they have. But the key to doing all this well is to having a very good control group that we can model. We work very closely with economists to do this. So there's a kind of social science dimension to this, but it is very doable. The basic question is, are students better off in the wages they earn as a result directly, causally of enrolling in an institution? And do they typically get a wage bump that's greater than the cost they're asked to pay? So to get back to your question, if we want to take the next step in public policy and start to actually form opinions about institutions and to tie ever more, let's say, strict decisions around higher ed funding and credibility to institutions based on these economic outcomes, we owe them measuring it really, really well and really, really fairly. And that's what we're focused on.
Thanks, Steve. Tony, similar question. You're talking about academic achievement and finding ways to ensure that students are actually learning something when they're at their preferred college or university. How do you measure that? That seems maybe even more difficult.
Well, in the community of accreditation, there's those outcomes that are student achievement and student learning related that are more tangible and, of course, and measurable, such as those economic ones that Stig has mentioned, and there are those that are more abstract. And as you go on that continuum from tangible to more abstract, the importance of the involvement of peer evaluators, peer-to-peer evaluation of all of those factors, of the strength of the curriculum, the measurement of student progress through the curriculum over the course of the program, not to mention the course of a week or a semester, becomes even more important. And because that focus and that rigor has, we believe, been lacking in many cases, the demand for enrollment among students has also lagged across much of higher education. Now, there's a lot of different reasons that are attributed to that weakness in enrollment demand, but certainly the focus on the value proposition of higher ed, if we can bring that up and bring that into the conversation, is in fact dealing with a ratio that is price paid versus benefit received, going back to Stig's discussion. What you'll find, though, in most cases, because that value proposition, once it becomes present in the political environment, quickly focuses on the numerator and not the denominator, because the numerator is really easy to measure. How much did it cost? What did they pay for? And then the second part, which is really where the accreditation has to be the value added, is how do we assess the value that the student received for that investment? Some of the value that they received, of course, will be post-graduation employment and income levels, but that's only a tiny part of it. You know, what we all have in common across all higher ed and across all accreditation, I'm not sure this is true also with the Department of Ed, but they can weigh in on their own behalf, is that we're all really in the business of human development and developing a human being as they enter the higher education community, the higher education factory, if you will, means paying attention to all of the dimensions that need developing, not only the intellectual and the economic, but also the spiritual and the emotional, and really a lot of focus on self-esteem. So asking students to perform up to a standard that maybe has been weakened or put on the sidelines over a period of time for a variety of reasons also leads to underperformance, lower expectations, and we believe unsatisfactory student achievement. We want to raise those standards and articulate them from the time the student enters the institution, if not actually using those standards to help our institutions attract and remedy that lagging enrollment demand.
Thanks, Tony. Rob, so maybe you have an approach that's dissimilar from Steeg's and maybe not quite what Tony's talking about. I find you're maybe in the middle of the two. So maybe tell us why their approach is wrong and yours is the best. I think you're muted, Rob.
So I guess overarching, I think we should have a bunch of accreditors that focus on different aspects of academic excellence. And so I don't have any quibbles with my colleagues' approaches. I think they're great for the schools that want to go that direction. And I think really just to underscore the triumph of the changes that you described, Michael, in your opening. It really has ushered in a new world, not just because of competition between existing accreditors and the support for new accreditors, but really the opportunity to move beyond a very tired, a very spent form of accreditation, which is the one-size-fits-all accreditation that grows out of the regional orientation, right? Which is to say, all schools are going to be accredited by a region. All of us on this call are interested in alternatives to one-size-fits-all and choice, right? And the choice that AALE offers is an institution the opportunity to demonstrate why its academics are good through the principle of liberal education. Liberal education is an idea whose time is not now. It might even be said that liberal education has disappeared. Those who are strong in the consumer protection orientation these days see liberal education as a term of fraud, even. But from our standpoint, liberal education is the core of what goes on in higher education. And that is to say that at an institution, you should have multiple points of view. It should be something of a marketplace. There should be the freedom of students to follow their intellectual interests, to follow where their inquiries happen. Most folks of my generation, I'm in my early 60s, had that experience in college. A lot of students in the last 20 years have not had that experience. There are real parameters as to where you can go as an academic or as a student. And finally, the core of liberal education is to have great instruction because college education is a guided journey. You need a deepening of thinking, and you need excellent instructors to help you confront texts and difficult questions and points of view and so forth. So in a word, AALE is about, extraordinary quality of academics. If that's what you're interested in, and you're interested in liberal education, AALE has standards that are worked up around liberal education for mission, curriculum, faculty, learning outcomes, and assessment. That's what AALE is all about.
So I want to keep the conversation going, but in a few minutes, we'll transition to audience questions for people who are watching online, and just want to make sure that everybody knows who's watching how to do that. So first, you can submit questions to Sean Doolan, which is SEAN.DOOLAN @AEI.org. Again, Sean.Doolan, DOOLAN @AEI.org. Or you can post them on X or Twitter if you prefer. And that's with the hashtag AEI accreditation event. And That information, by the way, is also on the AEI event page where you initially RSVP'd. So find it there, send us your questions. But in the meantime, I'm really curious for each of you, really, whoever wants to take this question. When we were passing those regulatory changes in 2019, the overwhelming objection was this is going to be a race to the bottom. If you let new accreditors in, it's just going to be the lowest possible standard, and colleges and universities are going to jump ship to somebody who's just going to give them the easiest pass possible. But there are a couple things I've noticed since then. One, the traditional accreditors don't seem to be shutting down a whole lot of institutions on merit, right? Usually it's they're kind of circling the drain, and then they close their doors and lock them, and then the accreditor writes them a letter a couple weeks later and says, we have some questions we'd like you to answer about your finances. So it doesn't really seem like there's this strict accountability that we'd all like to see in college accreditation on academics, on student achievement, on even finances, and certainly not for, we've seen some of the disruption that's been happening at certain colleges and universities, and theoretically accreditors have standards about that you have to uphold student rights and make sure that they have access to their coursework, and oftentimes they don't, but I've not seen accreditors jumping in on that either. So there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of accountability now, but also what each of you are describing seems tough. That doesn't seem like an easy hurdle to pass. So why should a public institution that's cozy and comfortable and gets along well with its accreditor they've had for the last 100 years maybe, why should they give up all of that and spend a bunch of money transitioning to one of you when it sounds like you're going to actually hold their feet to the fire in a pretty significant way?
Well, I think, I'm sorry, go ahead, Steve.
I might
Go ahead, Tony.
Go ahead, Rob.
Okay, so real quickly,
you guys are going to have to be a lot less polite if you want to fight over which institutions are going to pick you.
So real quickly, Michael, you stated it. Why are schools not jumping to change accreditors now that they can? And that's just simply because they see accreditation for the purpose of one thing, which is access to federal aid. They don't believe that they are getting true value in terms of improving their institutions. And why change? If you've got a cozy relationship with an accreditor, you're getting access to Title IV, you're getting what you think you should get out of accreditation. Here's the real kicker, and this is something that's known on every campus, I believe, in the United States, certainly all the ones I've worked on. The accreditors are not holding institutions feet to the fire with respect to the quality of their academic programs. And that has to do with the approach that they take to quality, which is a student learning outcomes, continuous improvement. And it's not to say that those things don't have value, but the way that the accreditors impose this on institutions, every institution in the United States, I would venture to say, all the ones I've been a part of, I've had experience with hundreds of them, engage in a kind of duplicity and make-believe in presenting to the accreditors what the accreditors want to hear. It's a tragedy. It is the hollow core, and it ultimately plagues the entire accreditation landscape, not in the national accreditors, but in the regional accreditors. So with that going on for the last 30 years, you can't blame institutions for being very cynical about accreditation and just simply accepting the easiest path they can to Title IV financial aid. The opportunity for all the accreditors we're talking about here is to have accreditors that are actually interested in the quality of academics, the quality of academic programming, the quality of the student outcomes. And it requires going beyond that student learning outcomes, continuous improvement, prejudice, if you will, to get to that point. And I think, just in a word, again, moving beyond that one size fits all, where you got to have a standard that accommodates every single kind of institution, to focused accreditors that are for institutions that care about what the accreditor values. That's your way back to accreditors that are about rigor and really strong outcomes.
Others want to jump in on that question?
I think I'll just speak from our own experience and conversations internally on this question, Michael, which is that our aspiration is to be a race to the top accreditor. Maybe it's worth just concretizing a little bit what's required of an accreditor to become recognized. And then I'll describe some of the elective steps we'll take even beyond that to be focused on accountability. So to be a recognized accreditor, you have to take very seriously a bunch of things about a college or a university. They're written into a particular regulation called 602 that governs what an accreditor is supposed to do. And also, as part of the triad, an accreditor in many ways is to co-monitor compliance with federal student aid, which is a vast architecture of oversight. So a minimal price of entry for a competent accreditor does require it to be focused on accountability, and we're very committed to that. We'll then go further, as I mentioned, Michael, and I actually be very strict about making sure that as a baseline matter, any institution we accredit protects the economic future of its students and improves it. The net result of that, Michael, will be we will not have a stampede of institutions coming to us. And we will be, I think, if we do our work well, a place, though, that can shine a light on, hold up, and recognize some institutions that are overlooked now. And they're institutions that serve very high-need students, and to be recognized for the progress they make with those students, they actually crave, they want, they deserve to be measured really intelligently for the value add that they create for those students economically. And so we'll attract those very strong institutions we think that actually aren't given the credit that they deserve. But back to your question, Michael, at least in our case, our overt goal is to be an accreditor focused on fair, accurate accountability.
Yeah, no, that raises some good points, and it's clear that accreditors could do more to set a high bar and maybe make that a competitive advantage for your members, where it's truly a sign of quality that sets you apart from the rest. But the other thing to remember is that there are three parts to the regulatory triad. There's the Department of Ed, the accreditors, and the states, and all of them have to be working on ensuring that college and universities are held accountable for meeting basic requirements, but then also doing something positive on student achievement. And I'm not sure any of them are really doing an excellent job today. Tony?
Yeah, so just following up on what Rob said, I think it's important for us to recognize, particularly in the context of this particular program, and that is the future of accreditation, an awareness that what is produced by status quo accreditation structure and institutions is a phenomenon where you will see, in many cases, smaller or more robust institutions that do a better job with student learning and student achievement, but do not have the large infrastructure to maneuver through all of the process necessary to gain accreditation, struggle to get through the accreditation process as successfully and on a recurring basis. Large institutions that can really disguise, in many cases do disguise mediocrity, but have a robust bureaucracy to be able to process the accreditation demands on a recurring basis, do just fine. But their actual achievement in terms of student learning and academic excellence is subpar. So the question is, how does a new accreditor, in this case, NAAE, make sure that there is alignment between the phenomenon of student learning, student achievement, academic excellence with the accreditation standards that are applied to that institution, and finally that interface and the results of that interface can be developed as proof and evidence for presentation to the Department of Ed, who then has ultimate authority over recognition. That's how those three pieces fit together at a very high level. But for me, the starting point is never Department of Ed, and it's never the structure of accreditation in the US. It is who is looking out for student learning, student achievement, academic excellence, individual human development, and how can you, from those phenomena, develop standards and a method of accreditation that rewards excellence rather than just passes over mediocrity.
Just a reminder to submit your questions. It's Sean, SEAN.DOOLAN@AEI.org, or on Twitter, #AEI accreditation event. Just to make sure, I think each of you have sort of implied this, but let's clarify. Are each of you planning to seek Department of Ed, NSEKI recognition in order to be a Title IV gatekeeper?
Yes.
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 All right, we got everybody on the record. Good. So that will be a really interesting challenge, and I think Steve touched on the fact that you're all doing things a little bit different than some of the traditional accreditors. You're trying to carve out a place in the marketplace, but you also recognize that there's a whole litany of other things you have to do. You can't just have this one set of standards on, say, career-focused education or on the liberal arts, but you also have to take care of all the basics as well that are laid out in the Higher Education Act and the Department of Ed's regulations. So something to keep in mind. I'm wondering, though, if you could put, and I want to just kind of go through a few rapid fire questions if we could before we turn to some of the audience questions. But another thing is, there is a possibility for dual accreditation, and that is a risk, right? We talked about this. It's a risk for an institution to jump ship from the traditional safe accreditor to something new. Are you expecting that institutions will maybe do dual accreditation, maybe do it for a while? Or are you saying, look, we're not competing with HLC, we're not competing with WASC, we're fine to have them stay on with dual accreditation for a long time?
Well, let me just make a quick point there, because the dual accreditation piece to me is really key, because it de-risks that move for an individual institution, and it's part of the changes that you when you were at the department made, Michael. I think you get 5 years where you can hold more than one accreditor, and that could potentially open up the possibilities for these Florida and North Carolina schools as well, if they can help to incubate a new accreditor. I wrote a piece, a month or two ago for Christian colleges, encouraging them to look at incubating a new accreditor using the dual accreditation option, where they can help stand up a new accreditor while at the same time remaining accreditor, so it de-risks it. So I think that's a very, very important on-ramp. And as schools, I think, begin to realize that, hey, this is not business as usual, that schools are in fact changing accreditors, that they're evaluating accreditors, that there's starting to be differences between accreditors, that they will take seriously the opportunity to either help support one of us or help launch their own accreditors, because just the ability to have an accreditor that helps your kind of institution achieve its promise, that's a breakthrough. And that really is now possible with the changes that you alluded to.
Real quick, Tony and Stieg, do you agree, disagree?
Yes, we will be approaching schools probably as soon as this fall, with the proposition that short term they will be investing in dual accreditation, but with the intent that long term they can, once we achieve recognition, they can phase out their relationship with that prior accreditor at an institutional level, has nothing to do with the programmatic accreditors, so that they're not paying for and having to put resources into two sets of accreditation standards, two sets of accreditation processes, et cetera. Now, what that time frame will be for the transition, I can't tell you. Will it be 3 years? Will it be 5 years? It'll take as long as it takes.
Yeah, that's the trade-off, right? You have the possibility of being able to hang on to one horse while you switch to the other, but you also have to make sure you're adhering to both sets of standards at the same time. So that is the tough part. Steve, anything to add?
Not much. Maybe just to maybe just for the benefit of the audience, Michael, I'll just spend 30 seconds describing the process to become a recognized accreditor. We're an accreditor now. We're not recognized by the U.S. Department of Ed. It's a very demanding, appropriately demanding process to become recognized by the U.S. Department of Ed, especially if, as we do, there's an aspiration to be a gatekeeper for Title IV. It's a multi-year process. And I think what you're referring to, Michael, is in order to file a petition with the U.S. Department of Ed and then the SIECI, an accreditor, an aspiring accreditor like us, has to go out and practice its accreditation model. You have to actually implement it. And so you end up in this in-between state where we are now actually accrediting an institution as though we were their Title IV accreditor, but we're not, of course, we're not recognized. And so that's part of the work of filing a petition, mobilizing a petition, and eventually getting reviewed and recognized. There's then the election down the road for that institution and any others then to actually switch institutional accreditation to us or to any of us once and if we're recognized.
That's helpful context. Thanks. I do want to just go through with one more very quick, and by quick, I mean a sentence at the most. I'm wondering if you can tell me two things. And again, extremely brief. Fill in the blank. We are the accreditor that's part one. So who are you? And you might have some potential customers watching right now. So very, very short elevator pitch. Who are you? Why should they pick you? And then if you had to start an accreditor that's not your own, where do you see other gaps in the marketplace? If there are people watching who are thinking about starting an accreditor, maybe institutional, maybe programmatic, what is the accreditor that somebody else should start now that you've bravely led the way? Rob, can you answer those two things in a sentence or less?
Yeah, let me take the second one first. So one key thing is that the existing regional accreditors scope does not extend to non-degree. So what you have going on is that a lot of schools are now offering non-degree credentials, certificates, micro-credentials, it's all the rage. That is not covered by institutions accreditation. So that's a problem. It's something the SIECI is aware of. There's a huge opportunity for somebody to start an accreditor that would actually potentially tag on to the regionals, because I don't think they're interested in going that area. But that's a huge gap in the market, and I think someone will move forward with that. Secondly, just with ALE, we are the accreditor for liberal education. Our name says so. We believe liberal education is the cornerstone of higher education. We believe that the disappearance of this notion has a lot to do with higher education's sinking reputation and the perception of politicization that is so widespread.
Rob's the liberal arts guy, so a sentence or less was probably too much to ask. But let's see, Stieg. Let's see if.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'm not going to answer your second question because I don't have an answer to it. So I'll be exceedingly brief on that. Maybe by the end of this call, I'll have the energy to imagine a second accreditor apart from the one I'm already working on. And the Post-Secondary Commission is the accreditor for institutions that want to be recognized for and held accountable for doing extraordinary things for the economic opportunity of their students.
Tony.
So NAAE will be the accreditor for institutions that want to be rewarded, encouraged, and nudged towards academic excellence, towards robust scholarship, and the ability to promote independent thinking, free from any kind of doctrine or other political influences. If they're looking for an accreditor that says, we're going to reward and fortify all of those aspects of your operation, NAAE will be there to answer that call. And I believe there is demand in the marketplace for this. This institution is being formed out of a response to market demand, not something that we just thought up. In terms of opportunities for other accreditation. I'm totally with Rob. Such a need for other types of entry-level programs into post-secondary education that do not necessarily require a degree, that can also help promote not only closing the workforce gap that's out there, but also fixing enrollment demand decline, because a lot of those programs will just organically become entry points for students to seek ultimately a degree after they've used their micro-credential to work for a couple of years.
All right. With that, I want to transition to audience questions. If you're watching, hopefully those elevator pitches were compelling for you and you should reach out to our panelists today. I was hoping somebody was going to say law school, though. Somebody should start a new law school accreditor, but that's a fight for another day. First question we have from the audience is, each of you are talking about evaluating various good things that these institutions are doing, but how do you make sure what you're measuring is something that the institution is actually doing and it's value add, rather than just the fact that they're being selective and taking students who are already fairly well off on economic measures, for example?
I don't know who sent that question in, Michael, but we'd like to hire them. Look, we measure the wage gains that accrue to students from enrolling. And let me tell you how that can get done really badly. If you walk up to an institution that runs a really selective admissions committee and the kids go on to have great economic futures, it's possible, it's probably even likely the institution had nothing to do with it. Conversely, if you walk up to an institution that does the brave work of admitting students who need a lot, students from low-income backgrounds who otherwise would be destined for very low-wage futures, and those students do quite well out in the world, but aren't in the absolute terms remarkable, it's very easy to overlook the extraordinary work that that institution does for those students. So here's the bottom line: to take a look at any outcome in an institution of higher ed is impossible, essentially, until you pay attention to the actual student body in question. This is simple social science. You have to have a control group, especially if you're going to measure wage outcomes. And so this is what's so tricky about measuring the simplest, most basic thing of all, which is whether the salary that arises for a student after they enroll was actually improved or not by the act of enrolling in that institution. And so now I won't go on from here, Michael, but this is where data scarcity is such a problem here, and why, if we're going to measure seriously the effect, the causal effect of an institution on the wage outcomes, at least, you have to get into controlled measurement techniques that we're trying to work on. So it's certainly the case in our quantitative pursuit of wage outcomes that you can get after really controlled social science. We're trying to do that. And I can see that's much harder in other qualitative outcomes that are massively important, maybe even more important in students, because they're harder to baseline, they're harder to observe.
And I would just second what Steve's saying. I think risk-adjusted metrics, former Undersecretary Diana Jones has an excellent short piece. It's incredibly compelling. It's just simply evaluating the input in terms of the student and the outcomes. And you can really get a much better read on the effectiveness of institutions. I would just add that I think one of the impediments to the improvement of accreditation, though, is, this may sound like heresy, the effectiveness outcomes orientation. That's part of what should be a part of evaluating institutions. But it's also that orientation has been a huge impediment to institutions being better. I've worked with 10 or so institutions where what you find is they're doing something to satisfy the accreditor that they're an effective institution, and then they have a parallel operation which is actually improving teaching and learning on campus. That's a scandal. That's happening on a lot of campuses, and it has everything to do with an incorrect focus on effectiveness and outcomes, and not having effectiveness and outcomes be governed by an overall kind of common sense about what makes a good institution.
Tony,
Yeah.
I'm assuming you have a similar answer, but anything to add on top of what the
Well,
other folks are saying?
Rob hits it right on the nail on the head, because it is that misalignment between how those vital student outcomes are evaluated, measured, and proven, verified for purposes of accreditation and recognition purposes, versus what is actually happening in the classroom, in the instructional modality, the encounters between instructor and student. But I think from an accreditation standpoint, what's really important for everyone to recognize, and I know my colleagues recognize it, although they've not articulated as such, is that in the absence of instructors and faculty members and folks that are immersed in the providing of education at the post-secondary level, in the absence of them coming up with metrics and ways to measure the effectiveness, the impact that they're having on students, in the absence of them doing that and being pushed to do it, the vacuum is filled by government bureaucracy. And then the measurements and the metrics and the scales that are used are much less relevant, probably not even credible, and ultimately have very low validity, getting back to Stig's point about data-based. So it is a matter of encouraging faculty and folks that are immersed in the instructional and delivery of educational services to say, be constantly thinking about new and better ways, more robust ways to demonstrate to outsiders. Outsiders include accreditors, and it includes the Department of Ed, that your enterprise is actually delivering the promise that we have made and that we're paying for these students.
Hey,
We have
Michael,
another question. Yeah, go ahead, Steve.
30 seconds here. I just want to add one other peripheral or related thought to this question of quality, which is one of the fundamental remedies here, of course, is good information and transparency. So we can get convinced that the Post-Secondary Commission, that all institutions ought to be asked to deliver some basic economic safety and mobility to students, because almost all students agree on that, and it has bipartisan appeal. One remedy after that is to reveal to students and to their families deeply the design of an institution in every aspect, because they vary a lot, they should vary a lot, and to reveal to students and families, moreover, all the additional outcomes that an institution strives for, because they also vary nearly infinitely. So then students and family can choose with full information optimally. And that's also a bipartisan thrust now, I think, in higher ed accountability regulation in general and in accreditation practice.
Next question, and I'm glad we dwelled on that academic achievement and outcomes piece for a bit, because it is so crucial to get that right. So I appreciate the thoughts each of you had there. The next question, though, is a little bit more of a state politics question. So states are passing these bills, and a lot of credit, I think, goes to Florida and Governor DeSantis down there, as well as now North Carolina has followed, and I know other states are looking at this. But is there an issue in the Florida bill where they require some of these schools to switch not just once, but then each cycle after that? Is that something, I know that provision gives me pause, but is that a provision that should be accommodated, or would you try to work with states to change that and say, look, we want them to move away from what's been the default all along, perhaps, but if you find a good mission aligned fit, maybe you don't need to switch every time?
Yeah, I would just say that, I believe the Florida bill sunsets. So it really is about changing once, and it's about getting out of SACs. Rightly or wrongly, I would say mostly rightly, the Florida views SACs as having been very political, but also as having added little value. North Carolina is also SACs. And as it stands, North Carolina is we're going to require you to change every 5 years. I think they're going to probably change that. So I would see those efforts as primarily as to get out of SACs and to move to another accreditor. Changing accreditors is a big deal. I spent some time with Florida schools, not looking forward to spending $10 million to change from an accreditor that looks a lot like the accreditor that you just left. So in many ways, I think what this panel is suggesting today is that it's one thing to have a marketplace of accreditors with the existing accreditors. It's another thing to have a marketplace of accreditors with new accreditors that are not all one size fits all. That's where this really gets interesting. And I think that's
Yeah.
where we're headed.
Yeah. And I just want to add, for the record, this is not and has never been, as we talked about, I worked on these regulations. This has never been an attack on the existing accreditors. This has been an attack on the existing accreditation system where they have a monopoly. So if the response, and I've talked to some of the traditional accreditors and they've said, great, bring it on, bring on the competition. And I think that's really what you want to see out of this. If the accreditors are adapting and doing new things and they're competing and winning, great, they deserve it. But if they're not, then I think that's part of the problem. I do want to just kind of get a couple more audience questions in if we can. So you sort of touched on this, Rob. It's expensive to switch accreditors. And part of that is hiring a bunch of consultants, and it just is really, really hard to get and keep your accreditation. But also, these traditionally, the institutions pay the fees to the accrediting organizations, and as some have pointed out, including this person who sent in this question, that causes a bit of a conflict of interest if your revenue is dependent on your institution. So, are you doing that? So, I guess kind of a couple part question for anybody who wants to take it. One, are you going to make it less expensive? Is there some way you can streamline this a bit so you don't have to have all these lawyers and consultants doing this? And second, are you finding ways to avoid the conflict of interest that comes from a institution-driven revenue model?
Was that for everybody, Michael, or is it
whoever wants to take it? But all you.
If and when we're recognized an accreditor and we commence operation as an enduring one, we will charge either no fees or modest fees, inconsequential fees to the institutions with whom we work, to keep the relationship completely sort of pure. That's an easy thing to aspire to do. We'll have to find an alternative revenue model that doesn't create any conflicts, maybe through philanthropy, candidly, or maybe doing a program evaluation work completely unrelated and for fees, but unrelated to our accreditation practice. The other thing I'll say is that on this question of lowering the transaction costs and the compliance costs of accreditation through these standard reviews. Yes, but only within reason for two reasons, Michael. One is it is an arduous process to oversee a complex institution. So we're interested in making it less burdensome or needlessly so. The other thing I'll just say is that we're completely committed to doing what we're asked to do by the federal law 602 and by federal student aid. And there are very clear rules about what we have to do, whether we like it or not. And we're totally signed up to do it. And so I do think there's room to, especially if you measure some outcomes separately and very energetically, as we will, to yield discretion back to institutions. But it's got to be within the constraints of federal student aid and federal law for any accreditor. And so there's a limit to that for good reasons and for practical reasons.
And just real quickly, Florida has an excellent study of the cost of accreditation for its public institutions. And it's about 10 million per institution, but it's all about the amount of staff time and the amount of work done to comply with the standards. And that can be streamlined. ALE is an example of that. One thing, ALE is working on a model of institutional accreditation where you'll have the core academic piece and you'll have a federal checklist. These are the things you need to do to access Title IV. I think that can be a streamlined approach that will cut down on the compliance costs of institutions dramatically.
And I agree with that. I think one of the keys to holding down the cost and keeping it as affordable as possible for member institutions is to start with a structure and an infrastructure that is as streamlined and as dependent on the available technology, rather than adopting the technology subsequent and trying to apply it to an amalgam of hard copy enterprises that have built up over the years. So we're really looking forward to be able to do that and deliver that kind of cost effectiveness to our accreditation system.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us here today. It's so exciting that we have 3 different organizations that are embarking on this process of starting a new accreditor, where for decades before we had none. And you're all here today. Couldn't be happier that you're able to join us and share some of the great work that you're doing. Please keep us posted. Best of luck. And thanks for joining us here today.
Thanks, Michael.
Thank you.